Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin, daf Kuftet Zayin. We're going to get started from where we left off. We now are up to the new reading of what Rav Mordechai said to Rav Ashi, which is Hachi Amrina Mishmei Derish Lakish. What are we trying to do? We're trying to figure out why we needed Kilei HaKerem in addition to Orla and Chametz B'Pesach. First, we wanted to know why we can't just have the two of them. And then we said, that's because we could have said they have a feature that Basar B'Chalav don't have. Remember, we're trying to learn, how do we know that these items, how do we know that Basar B'Chalav is forbidden to benefit, not only forbidden to eat, but also to benefit? And that's because these other items, all three of them, are forbidden to eat and also forbidden to benefit. And they're going to build a paradigm. But why do we need all three? We could have learned it from the two. Well, no, because the two have a feature that's not in Basar B'Chalav, which is, and then that would have broken the least common denominator argument, and that's that they grow from the ground. To which the Gemara said, but also Kilei HaKerem grows from the ground, right? Because then we said, Chada Mechada, right? He had this whole thing, which was a little bit confusing to understand at the end of yesterday's daf, that if it was a Kol Dehu, you could have used the feature argument, but it's Chada Mechada, we're learning really Basar B'Chalav from Kilei HaKerem, and that has to be knocked out by some halachic argument of this has a stringency that one doesn't have. It won't help to use this, it grows from the ground. But the Gemara says, but in the end, we're actually learning it from all three. We're not learning one from one. We're learning it from all three. If we're learning from all three, really from this idea of the least common denominator between all three, then we should be able to knock it out by saying, these all have the same feature. They all grow from the ground. Basar B'Chalav doesn't, and that should have worked. So now we're going to start the last line of yesterday's daf. Ela Amar of Mordechai Rav Ashi. So now we're going to come up with another explanation, which is, we're going to reinterpret what Rav Mordechai said. Hachi Amrina Mishmei Derish Lakish. This is what they say in the name of Rish Lakish. Chada Mechada. Now he's going to give three categories. There's Chada Mechada, which we already talked about, which we actually don't have here at all. But he's going to set it up anyway. Chada Mechada, right? You can see this is right? We're going back to what he said, Rish Lakish said, but we're going to expand on it. And I would say edit it a little bit. Chada Mechada, Kula B'Chumra Parchina, Kol Dulo Parchina. Okay, if it's Chada Mechada, and this is what he said before, okay? If it's one thing from one thing, we're going to say, okay, if there's a stringency, we can knock it out. But we can't just knock it out because there's some unique feature to that one item. Because one-to-one, unique features don't really bother us when we're trying to learn one from another. But once you already have two things and you say, these two are similar, we're going to say it applies to something else as well. Well, then they have to be similar. So, afilu koldu parchina, any kind of issue, like a feature, like they grow from the ground, can be used to knock out the drasha, right? The paradigm. However, what if it's chada mitzlat? And that's our case. What if we're learning from three items to one item, three cases to one case? Now here we're going to have a split. It's going to depend. Now if the drasha, in the language of the drasha, they go back and they say, remember we had before, lo rizeh ki rizeh, this one doesn't look like this one, that one doesn't look like that, what's the least common denominator? Now, we didn't say this in our case. If they go back and they say, what's the least common denominator between these three things, and then we're going to learn from there to something else, then parchina koldu, then we can knock it out with any sort of drasha. Because we can say, look, least common denominator, but they actually have a denominator that's not in the fourth item. But these items are all similar. Yes, they're all forbidden to eat and they're all forbidden to benefit, but they're also all they grow from the ground. But that's only when you said, what's the least common denominator? V'lo, if you didn't say that, and you're trying to learn from three things, now generally when you try to learn from three things, it actually makes it much stronger. So it's going to be harder to knock out. Unless you say what's the least common denominator. If you didn't say what's the least common denominator, kula b'chumra parchina and kol dulo parchina. And then it's going to be exactly like the chada mechada, which is you can only knock it out if you have a stringency, but not if you say, these all have some sort of similar feature. And that's why we needed Kilei HaKerem in the picture. But now the Gemara has one other question, which is v'lifroch ma Kilei HaKerem shelo hayta lahem shata koshel. But wait, you could have said the Kilei HaKerem has a stringency that's not in Basar B'Chalav, which is it was never able to be eaten because as soon as it grows, which is when it grows, right, the kilayim, the two things that grow together, it's forbidden to eat. So it never could have been eaten. So that would be a stringency it has over basar b'chalav, and that theoretically could have knocked it out. To which, Rav Ada bar Ava says, Zot omeret, from here you can infer that they didn't question that. We're going to explain some halacha and base it on the fact that it must be the kilei kerem does have a shad kosher. There's some point where you can eat it. Now, in order to establish this, it's a little bit tricky, this part, so bear with me. Kilei kerem ikaran ne'esal. The things that grow, okay, so I plant my seeds next to my vine within a close proximity that makes it forbidden. What's going to happen is as soon as it starts to grow, not only is what grows forbidden, but the seed and the stem and all of it is forbidden because of kilayim. Now, how does that help us? Well, that means that haytalem shata kosher kodem hashvasha. If we say that only what grows is forbidden, then there was never a shat hakosher. There was never a time that could have been eaten, because as soon as it grew, it was forbidden. But if we say, now when are kilei akarim going to be forbidden? Once they start taking root. Now before it starts taking root, there's actually something that grows there. There's the seed, and there's a little bit starting to grow out of it. Now that's not forbidden at the beginning, because it hasn't yet grown together with the vine. Only once it takes root is it forbidden mishum kilayim, and at that early stage, that little seed and the little bit that was growing were actually permitted. But then they become forbidden. So now if we don't count that, if we don't say the stem and the seed are forbidden, then only what grows is forbidden, and what grows never had a time that it could have been eaten. But since we're going to say now that the ikar must be forbidden, this is all the proof. He's working backwards. He said there must be a way that there was shad kosher, which means that the stem and the seed must be forbidden. In other words, again, then what happens on the timeline? Well, first they're there and they're not forbidden. As soon as the kilayim grows, right, the seed here grows, then it's going to, as soon as it takes root, whatever grows now is going to be forbidden, and whatever had grown before is going to be forbidden. So now that thing from before had a shad kosher, and now it's not able to be eaten. So that, and it would be forbidden mishum kilayim, and that would be a prohibition of kilayim that had a shad kosher. So again, this is all because we could have questioned, and we didn't question from that. It must mean that their ikar is forbidden. However, Mativ Rav Shmaya bar Ze'eri, he says, wait a minute. How could you say that the whole, once the kilayim start to grow, right, whatever you planted in this forbidden manner starts to grow, everything, the base of it, right, everything becomes forbidden? That's not true. Listen to this Mishnah. We're now going to make a parallel case, although you're going to see it's not really parallel, and that's how we're going to resolve this problem. But let's bear with me for a minute. You take a plant. You have a plant of something that was growing, and it has holes in the bottom of it, and which means it's going to attach to the ground when you move it to wherever you move it to. So you planted it somewhere where it was totally fine. It was in a planter with holes in it, but it was nothing, no problem. Something grew out of there, and now you take it, your plant, and it's seeds, right? So it's seeds of something, let's say cherry tomatoes, and you put it in your vineyard, okay? You put it down on the ground in your perforated pot. So your ma'avir atzitz nakuv bekerem, you put it in a vineyard now. So now it's going to become kilayim. But what grew before in your cherry tomato plant wasn't yet kilayim. Now, you need to know one other fact, which is if you have a mixture of kilayim, and as you have something that's forbidden mishum kilayim, and it gets mixed up with something that's not, it could be nullified, but in how much? Not 1 in 60 like we've been talking about milk and meat, but 1 in 200, because kilayim is more strict. Okay, and therefore 1 in 200. That's just a fact. So im hosif matayim asul. Now, if you have this plant that's growing, this cherry tomato plant, and it had grown separately, and now you move it to your vineyard, as soon as it starts to grow, it's going to be forbidden what grows from there, but it has to be 1 in 200. When it gets to the 1 in 200, okay, where you grow one amount of, let's say there were 199 or 200 cherry tomatoes, and now one new one grows since it was in the vineyard. Okay, they don't exactly grow in that way. The cherry tomatoes, we're not exactly talking about cherry tomato, but it could be the growth and all that. let's just use it as a simple way to visualize it. So we have 200 cherry tomatoes and now one more grew. At that point, it's going to be forbidden because that's too much. Because 1 in 200, right, is not nullified. Now, if I had less than that, okay, I had 2, or let's say 1 and a bit more than to 200. If I have less than that, it's actually fine because there's so much more that's not kilayim that will nullify. So let's say I have a baby cherry tomato and I have 200 big ones. So they're going to nullify very easily that one, and there's not going to be any prohibition. Now, what do you see here? When that cherry tomato starts to grow, now that it's in the vineyard and that one is forbidden, what's going to happen? Well, if you say the ikar is nesal, once something starts growing, everything before it, the seed and everything else is forbidden, then the entire cherry tomato plant should be forbidden because now it's in the vine. And now all of that becomes forbidden. And that's definitely not what it said. Because it says here, imosif matayim asur, only if it gets to 1 to 200. But hosif in lo hosif lo, if it didn't get to 1 to 200, it would all be permitted. We wouldn't forbid the rest of it. So it looks like the stem and the seed and everything that was there before doesn't become forbidden down the road. And that goes against what Rav Ada bar Ava said. But Amar Abaye, I'll explain it to you. Trei Kraig Tibe. It's not actually 2 verses, even though it sounds like what they're saying. 2 different words in the verse. And this is a very confusing pasuk to read from the simple reading, but I'll read it to you anyway. Ktiv, okay, I'll read you the whole pasuk. Lo tizrak kamercha kilayim, don't plant your vineyard don't plant seeds in your vineyard. Pen tikdash, which we understood as pen tukat esh, lest you'll have to burn it. Hamile'a hazera, the full growth and the seed. Now, what does it mean, the full growth and the seed? Or the seed. It's not even and the seed. It's very hard to read this simply. But anyway, it talks about full, and it talks about the growth, and it talks about the seed. So, how can we talk about, right, it's either one or the other, right? It's either the whole thing or it's the seed. So, what do they say? Ha-ketzad, how do we read this? Zarua mi'ikaro, we're going to say, this pasuk is distinguishable between 2 different cases. If it's planted from the start in the vine, which was case number 1 we saw, behashrasha, as soon as it takes root, the whole thing's going to be forbidden. Zarua uba, but if it was already, something had grown beforehand in a way that was permitted, like in this planter, hosif in lo hosif lo, then the whole thing doesn't become forbidden, only the added part. And then the added part could theoretically be nullified or not, depending on the amount. Okay, so that was the issue with Kilei HaKerem. We'll just quickly summarize. We have why do we need that third case, and we explained based on Rav Mordechai's explanation, according to Rish Lakish, of the rules of the game. If you have 3 and you didn't say b'ma'atzad, then you can't knock it out by some feature. And that's why we're not worried. We needed all 3, and Gilulei Karka wouldn't have worked. If we just had the 2 and we used a ma'atzad, it would have been canceled out, and that's why you needed Kilei HaKerem. Then came Rav Ada bar Ava. Then the Gemara said, why don't you ask this question from Kilei HaKerem and say, they never were able to be eaten, and that's more strict than Basar B'chalav. And maybe that would have knocked out this Kal Chomer argument, to which Rav Ada bar Ava says, from here we can infer that must be the stem and the seed and all that are forbidden even before it takes root, and that would make it a case where it theoretically, part of it could have been eaten before and only became forbidden later, and therefore it's not a knockout. Amar Abaye. Matnitin. We're up to Matnitin de lo ki haitana. Our Mishnah is not like the following Braita. Our Mishnah said that it's forbidden to benefit from them, right? Now we're going to see Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon Basar b'chalav asur b'achila umutar b'hana. He says they're actually permitted to benefit from basar b'chalav. It's only forbidden to eat, not to benefit. Here, if you thought, where was all that 3 times it says that we've been learning all, right, that we always grew up on, forget about that. Maybe it was learned out from somewhere else. This, it's not even forbidden to benefit from. Where does he get it from? Shnei Amal, ki am kadosh ata, because you're a holy nation, right? That's where it talks about in basar b'chalav. V'de'amar lahalan ba'anshe kodesh tiyun li, which is about the treifa. Ma lahalan asur b'achila mutar b'hana. Just like there, it's forbidden to eat and permitted to benefit. Av kan asur b'achila mutar b'hana. Also here, same thing. It's going to be forbidden to eat and permitted to benefit. Now we're going to go to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva Omer Chayav Of. We're going to go back to the Mishnah, And we're going to talk about, okay, we had the difficult part of the daf, now we're going to have an easy part, and then we're going to get back to a difficult part of the daf. Or challenging, I would say. So we go to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says chayav auf. And if you remember, he had the 3 times where it said, don't, 3 times we just mentioned, right? It's a basar b'chalav, don't eat 3 times, it says. And 1 to exclude undomesticated animals, 1 to exclude birds, and 1 to exclude non-kosher animals. So now they say, Hane havkinu l'chid Shmuel. But wait, didn't we learn a different drasha of Shmuel that it excludes the ones that Isser Chal Isser, right? That it includes that we do say Isser Chal Isser in these cases if the animal was dead on its own and you mixed it with milk, or if it was the chelev, the forbidden fats, and 1 time to exclude the non-kosher animal. Well, that's the same as Rabbi Akiva. So we really have to just deal with that one. And there was a second, right? We had actually, those 2 were 1, the chelev and the animal that died. Then we had the shliel, the fetus, and then we had the third, which was the behemat me'ah. So the behemat me'ah, they both agree about. But what about the other 2? So, kasaval Rabbi Akiva isser chal isser chelev u'meita lo tzrichei kras. So we get rid of the chelev and the meita because we say he holds in general isser chal isser. You don't need a special drasha to tell me that. He thinks that it's always the case. Now, if you remember, Shmuel said the way we explained Shmuel was, well, we learn it from here, but according to this explanation, Rabbi Akiva must have learned it from somewhere else, and therefore doesn't even need to learn it from here. Shliel gedima al Yehu. You don't need a drasha for the fetus because that's just a gedi. We call it a gedi. Okay, it was born to a gedi. It's a gedi. It was, in utero in the gedi. So then all the 3 are open to get to his 3 drashot. Okay, now we get to Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Very interesting. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, Ne'amar kan lo tochlu. Remember, it says don't eat any nevela. Anything that potentially could be a nevela is part of it. But wait, not a bird, because, right, so he includes a chaya when Rabbi Akiva doesn't in the prohibition. But when it comes to a bird, he agrees with Rabbi Akiva that a bird is out, but for a different reason. He said, because it doesn't have chalav ein, it doesn't have its mother's milk. So, ma ikabein Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva? What's the difference between them? Ikabein ayu chaya. Okay, that's obvious, right? They differ on the chaya. Rabbi Yossi Aglili savar chaya de'oraita. He says chaya is learned out by Torah law. That's what he says. Lo tu'chlu kol nevela. That includes an undomesticated animal. But Rabbi Akiva savar chaya de'rabanan. Rabbi Akiva holds that the chaya is only forbidden by rabbinic law. Notice, he doesn't learn it out from the Torah, but he does think it's forbidden. He doesn't think you could go cooking deer meat in milk, okay? He just says it's only rabbinic. That's the difference. But now the Gemara adds a second option. Now, it's not an option where ibait ema, which means, okay, well, if you want, you could say something else. Now, it doesn't mean here we disagree with number 1 position. Number 1 stands no matter what. Of course, that's enough to mean it between them. Okay, but there's a second optional, or this one is a potential. This one isn't clear, but it is somewhat, it's going to be clear because we're going to basically prove that this is correct. And this is really, really interesting. So what does he say? Ibait ema of ikabenayu. Even in birds, they disagree. Now we said birds, they don't disagree. They both think that birds are not a problem. Okay, birds are not forbidden. So we're going to say, what's the difference between them? Well, Rabbi Akiva saval chayav of einam min Torah. Right? Rabbi Akiva says, look, undomesticated animals and birds, they're not by Torah law, but hami derabanan asire, but by rabbinic law, they're forbidden. For Rabbi Yossi Aglili savar of afilu miderabanan nami lo asir. Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds birds, even by rabbinic law, are also not forbidden. Meaning, you can eat birds, chicken with milk, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili. And in fact, Tanya Nami Hachi, there's a brighter to support this. In the place where Rabbi Eliezer lived, they would chop down trees to make coal, to forge the metals, to make knives for Brit Milah. Okay, what are we talking about? On Shabbat. Okay, this is very radical. You can do a Brit Milah on Shabbat in unique cases, right? Where the baby is 8 days old exactly on Shabbat, in a definitive manner, not like it was born Ben Hashmasha, like at twilight on Friday, but when it's definitely born on Shabbat, and the Brit Milah is on Shabbat, you're allowed to do it. But most people think just the Brit Milah you're allowed to do, not what we call machshirei milah, not permitted to do other malacha like this one, for example, cutting down trees to make the metal, to make the knife, to be able to use it for the circumcision. But Rabbi Akiva thinks even machshirei milah override Shabbat. Again, only in a case where you're supposed to do the brit milah on Shabbat. So if you live, okay, this has nothing to do with anything, but you'll see in a minute what we mean. People who lived in the city of Rabbi Eliezer would do this because that's what their rabbi said. Even though it wasn't the mainstream position, since they lived in that town, they would do that. And here comes why we brought this. Okay, in the place of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, they would eat chicken with milk. Wow. Okay, by the way, if we go back to Daf Kuf Gimel and Kuf Daled, where we're talking about chicken and waiting between milk and meat and milk and chicken, and we said, some of the explanations there by the Rishonim were trying to figure out how could that be, saw that they claimed that was Rabbi Yossi Aglili's position, perhaps who permitted it entirely, and that's why you can eat it any way you want without washing your hands, without anything. Okay, so that's just something to have in mind. Okay, we're going to end this section with the story of Levi. Levi Ikla, he comes Lebei of Yosef Rishba. He gets to the house of Yosef the hunter. Aitu lekame reisha detavsa b'chalva, and they put in front of him peacock cooked in milk. Okay, a bird with milk. Below Amar Lahu v'lo midi, and he didn't say anything. He didn't start saying, "What are you doing? You can't do this." So ki'ata lekame de Rebbe. When Levi comes before Rebbe heard what happened. And he says to Levi, Amar le, Amaylo tashmitinu, why don't you put the guy in excommunication, this Yosef the hunter? He served you milk and chicken and milk. Amar le, so Levi says, what do you mean? Atre de Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteru. The place where he was living was the place where Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteru, who was a very early Tana, is from. Ba'amina darash lehu ki Rabbi Yossi Aglila da'amar yatsa of she'en lo chalav im. He says perhaps, now he didn't know for sure, but he said maybe in the place of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteru, who actually was 2 generations before Rabbi Yossi Aglili, okay, but maybe he held that same position that eventually Rabbi Yossi Aglili held, that chicken could be eaten together with milk. And maybe that's why he did it. And that's why I didn't put him in excommunication. So we have this machloket. Rebbe says, what? No way, no how. And we have this approach of Levi, which is what we call danat kol adam l'chav zchut, right? Try to find a good... looking on the optimistic, the bright side, maybe he really was holding, maybe in that place, that's what they did. Okay, so you see here that there was clearly this understanding of Rabbi Yossi Aglili permitted it completely. Okay, moving on to the next Mishnah. This is all about making cheese, and we're not going to have enough time in the daf to go into all the details of practically speaking how this is made, but you could try to look up some articles online about it. There's a really good article by Howard Jachter, about how we, the hechsherim, okay, you can see also like some of the difficulties and the issues come out from this sugya. Okay, number one, about eating cheese that was made from, okay, there's a bunch of issues we're going to see. First of all, there's chalav, there's gvinat akum, like non-Jewish cheese, which is an issue which we're going to see. It came up in a sugya in Avodah Zarah, actually, also. Anyway, a lot of the issues about cheese, right? Cheese is generally made from rennet, which is an enzyme found in the lining of the walls of the stomach of an animal. Okay, but nowadays we often make it from vegetables, okay, from plant-based enzyme and not animal-based. Okay, so that's one issue. So also nowadays they dry out the animal. We're going to see all these issues. I'm kind of giving you a little bit of the practical before, but they dry out the enzyme from the animal so that it's no longer really from the like meat anymore. Okay, but we're going to talk about all this anyway. I just want you to know a little bit about the issues, but you can read up about it. Not really so much for Daf Yomi Shir, more for Halacha Shir. Anyway, let's get started with our Mishnah. The first thing to understand about this Mishnah, there's 4 sentences. Okay, maybe even 3 sections. We could call it the last section has 2 sentences, and they're each a little bit dealing with different things. And you'll see right away there's a lot of issues in this Mishnah. Kevat nochri v'shal nevela. If you find milk in the stomach of a non-Jew, of a non-Jew's animal, we assume that's what it means, and of a nevela, and of an animal that was not slaughtered properly. Okay, the Gemara is later going to say, what do you mean? A non-Jew, even if you slaughter it properly, it's considered nevela, so why do we have these as 2 separate cases? They're really one and the same. A non-Jew doesn't need to be mentioned here because any non-Jewish animal that was killed or slaughtered is a nevela. So we'll get back to that. But right now we have milk. Now what happens is when the milk's in the stomach, it curdles. So the milk that curdled in the stomach of a non-Jew or a nevela, harezo asuha. Now this sounds pretty simple and pretty straightforward. It's a nevela because it was found inside, and this went through this process, inside the stomach of a non-Jew, of a non-kosher animal. Okay, which makes it sound like, and I'm specifically saying this because we're going to see a sentence in the Mishnah which seems to say not the case, makes it sound like the milk. Now, where is this milk coming from? It's not the milk that was in the udders, right? It's milk that was eaten from some other animal and now went through a process within that animal. And the assumption is that the milk has the status of the animal that it's inside of. Kind of takes on the status, right? You are what you eat. This is, you are not, it's the opposite of you are what you eat, right? What's inside what you ate becomes part of you. Okay. Now we get to a second case, which is something completely, not completely, but somewhat different. It's another way of making cheese, which is what we talked about, the rennet. And here we're talking about a kosher animal. If you take the lining of the stomach of the kosher animal, i.e. the rennet, now, some people have a girsa without kshera. I'm just going to point it out, but I'm not going to get into it right now. If you take, turning out amibet, if you made cheese from taking, the first process of the curdling of the milk happens inside the body, right? The milk was eaten by the animal and were ingested by the animal, and now the process happens inside. If you take the lining out of the animal and you put it into your milk to create the cheese, then, and it's a kosher, the lining of a kosher animal, so we're not talking about not kosher, but what's the problem? The lining of the stomach of the animal is like meat. So, im yesh bo benoten tam harezo asura. If it gives flavor and it tastes like meat, this cheese now has a meat flavor in it, it's going to be forbidden. But it sounds like if not, it's going to be permitted. Now note the wording though. It's only if you did it already. It doesn't sound like you can actually do it, what we call lichatchila, ab initio. Since it's milk and meat, you can't do it. Now what's the problem? It's not being cooked. Well, a chemical process is happening. That's what some people think the problem is. And that's kind of like cooking. Or perhaps you leave it there for 24 hours, and 24 hours is like kavush. If you remember, we had maliach is like rotech, and kavush hareu kumivushal, by pickling something. Generally, we mean by leaving something together for 24 hours, even without heat, that's going to transfer, and that's what happens here. So you can't do it ideally, but if you did it and it doesn't have flavor, it's going to be permitted. That's why, as I said before, when you want to make kosher cheese, you have to, number one, it has to be from a kosher animal, but even if it is from a kosher animal, it still has the problem of basar b'chalav, and you can't do it ab initio, even if it's not going to have enough flavor. So that's why they dry it out, and they make it like it's not even food anymore, okay, before they use it to make the cheese. It's like part of the issue with the cheese process. Okay, anyway, let's keep going. Okay, so the case, I just want to summarize so we're clear. Case number one is the milk that curdled inside the stomach of the animal that was ingested by the animal and curdled there. There, if it's non-kosher, it's going to be a problem. If it's kosher, it seems like it's not a problem at all. And that's because it sounds like it takes on the status of the animal it's in. The second sentence was about taking the lining out of an animal, and it was a basar b'chalav issue. It was a milk and meat issue. In this case, it's going to be a problem. Okay. Third case is going back to case number one, of a case where we have milk that curdled inside the animal's stomach. But here it's going to say something that seems to contradict what we saw in part one, and we'll only get to that later in the Gemara today. If you have a kosher animal that nursed from a non-kosher animal, kevata asura, the milk that curdles in the stomach is forbidden. Why? Because it comes from a non-kosher animal. Even though right now it's in a kosher animal. If you say it goes by the status of the animal it's in, like we said before in the beginning part of the Mishnah, you would think then it would be permitted. Okay? But it doesn't say that. Okay? And then, here all the more so, if you're not convinced that it's a problem, treifa, if you have a non-kosher animal, she'yankamena treifa, that drank milk of a kosher animal, and then we have the milk that curdled inside this non-kosher animal, because it's a treifa, right? They had some issue with it. The milk in the stomach is permitted because it's just like something collected inside of it. The non-kosher, the treifa animal is just like a housing thing where it has something in it, but it doesn't take on the status of the non-kosher animal. The milk was kosher to begin with. The milk is still kosher now that it went through this process in the body of the non-kosher animal. So we're going to have to deal with the difference between them as we go through this stuff. The first question the Gemara asks is, on the first part I mentioned that was difficult with this Mishnah. Isn't the milk that's found in the stomach of this animal, a non-Jewish, right, this non-Jewish animal, should be considered a nevela, like a dead animal that was killed. So why are we listing these as two separate cases? For this, we're going to have two answers. Amar Rafuna. Rafuna says, "Hacha belokech gedi min hagoy askinan, v'chashinan shema yanak min atrefa." It's talking about a case where it was actually belonging to a Jew, but it was a Jew who purchased a kosher animal from a non-Jew. V'chashinan, and what's the issue? Well, you're worried that the milk inside of it, shema yanak min atrefa. Maybe the owner wasn't very careful because he was a non-Jew. What did he care if the animal was drinking milk from a treifa animal or not a treifa animal? Remember, an animal that's a treifa is an animal, let's go by the standard definition, that was going to die within 12 months. So certainly the non-Jew would have no care that he would nurse from a treifa, to which the Gemara said, what are you talking about? We're not worried that maybe an animal milked drank milk from a non-kosher and from a treifa animal. The Hatznan, look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, we learned this earlier in our Masechet, Lokchim beitzim min hagoyim ve'en chosheshim lo mishum nevela v'lo mishum treifa. You can buy eggs from a non-Jew, and you don't have to worry not for nevela, not for treifa, because the assumption is, okay, we won't deal with the nevela issue right now, but most eggs are not treif eggs. Okay, the nevela, there's most. You could just assume that most birds are in treifas. And likewise, you can assume most animals are in treifas. So why should we be worried if I buy it from a non-Jew? I can go buy a majority. I can assume that the milk was from a kosher animal. So that doesn't make much sense. So let's fix this. So again, Rav Huna said, it's not talking about a non-Jew's animal, it's talking about a Jew who bought from a non-Jew. And that's the case of Nuchri, and the case of Nevela in the Mishnah is, could be a non-Jew, could be a Jew that was a Nevela, either which way. Okay, again, this is the milk found in the stomach of one of these animals. So then there are two different cases. So, what's the issue if I buy from a non-Jew then? It's not we're worried that maybe the animal nursed from a treifa. Maybe it nursed from a non-kosher animal. That's much more likely, because it was a non-Jew who had lots of animals, and it's very likely. So now the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute. Why would you make a difference here? And if you're not worried it was a treifa, ate from a treifa, why are you worried that it ate from a non-kosher animal? To which they answer, treifa lo shchicha tmea shchicha. Because a treifa is very uncommon, and a non-kosher is very common. In a non-Jewish farm, it's very common they're going to have non-kosher animals. So that is a much more likely scenario. To which the Gemara asks, wait a minute. Ishchicha, if it's much more common, afilu gabei didani, so why aren't we worried about Jews? If I buy it from a Jew, maybe it ate in the Jew's farm from a non-kosher animal. But no, that's kind of obvious. But Anna and Debedilina, we keep away from non-kosher animals. And when we see them, we stay away from them. Meaning, if we see our animal going to start a nurse from a non-kosher animal, we're going to stop them because we don't want to have that scenario. And therefore, lo gazru b'Rabbanan. So if I buy from a Jew, I don't have to worry that maybe it drank from a non-kosher animal. But inu dilo b'dila minayu. But they have no reason to make a distinction between kosher and non-kosher. When they see this happening, they don't say, "Oh wait, don't do that." Gazru b'Rabbanan. So the rabbis made a decree. No. Okay, so now according to Rav Huna, again the Mishnah is talking about when it said nuchui, it doesn't really mean a non-Jew's animal, because that's included in the word nevela. It means a Jew who bought from a non-Jew, and you have to worry that maybe the milk is coming from a non-kosher animal. As we saw at the end of the Mishnah, coming from a non-kosher animal is the issue, right? Because the milk, it's the status of the milk, not in what animal is it found. But Shmuel gives a different explanation to the case of the nuchuri. And why is it listed separate from the nevela? Shmuel Amal, chad katane, it's all one case. It's telling you that even if a non-Jew shechs their animal, it's going to have the status of a nevela. And then it's really just one case. It's a nevela or non-Jews, which is an avela, but that's all really one case, because any non-Jew, even if he slaughters it, it's an avela. And then we're going to say, now again, what does this mean then? Well, now this is going to lead to our next question. Now let's read the Mishnah. The Mishnah is saying, which is how we read it in the beginning, but just pay attention, Shmuel says this, because we're now going to say this contradicts something else Shmuel said, which is if I find milk curdled in an animal of a non-Jews, or an avela, right, or the animal of a non-Jews that was slaughtered, it doesn't matter, right, and that's non-Jewish slaughter doesn't count, it's an avela, and that milk that curdled inside is forbidden. Gemara says, wait a minute. Umi amar Shmuel hachi, could Shmuel really have said this? V'ha'amar Shmuel, didn't Shmuel say, mipnei ma asru gvinat hagoyim, mipnei shema'amidim otam be'or kevat nevela. In this sugya, in Avodah Zarah, it said, why did they forbid? If you remember, they forbade all sorts of things of non-Jews. The rabbis came and made a decree, and they forbade all cheese from non-Jews. Now, why? Why did they forbid this? There's a big Gemara long sugya about this. It starts with the Tanaim and then goes to the Amoraim. Rabbi Yeshua gives a reason. Okay, well, this is just important background. He actually gives two reasons that are both rejected by Rabbi Yishmael. After they're rejected, Rabbi Yeshua has nothing to say anymore. He changed his mind. He said, you're right. So he doesn't really have an answer. And then the Gemara provides a whole slew of different answers. Okay, which leads to this whole question of can you have cheese of non-Jews or not because it was decreed. Tosfos tries to say, well, it was decreed for some reason which no longer exists, and he tried to permit it. It's a really interesting sugya in terms of development of halacha. But anyway, I'm putting that aside for right now. But first, I'm just going to tell you the first reason of Rabbi Yeshua that's rejected. He said, because it's very relevant to our sugya, he said the reason why it's forbidden is because ma'amidim, because they prepare it how? In the chalav, and with the milk that is congealed in the body of an avela. And that's why you can't eat their cheeses. Because, as we saw in the beginning of the Mishnah, right, that's a problem. Okay? And that would fit with what Shmuel's saying, except for, we're going to see it really doesn't fit at all. Okay? But it fits exactly. What's the problem? The problem is that Rabbi Yeshua is rejected. Now, if it was just that, we'd be in great shape, because that's exactly what he's saying. If you make the cheese from the milk that curdled in the non-kosher animal, the cheese is not kosher. And that's why we can't eat non-kosher. That's why we can't eat cheese from non-Jews, because we're going to assume that they curdled it in the stomach of the non-kosher animal. That's not what he said. He said, now, and not only is it not what he said, but they rejected Rabbi Yeshua's explanation. And then Shmuel says, yes, since you rejected Rabbi Yeshua, I'll bring you a different explanation, which means he clearly agrees with rejecting Rabbi Yeshua, which is a problem, because then the Mishnah is not true anymore. Okay, then the Mishnah is wrong. That's what we're going to say, basically. But I'll explain it in one more minute. Again, why did they forbid the Dvina of Goyim? I'm just going back to the words. Because what did they do? They take the lining out from the inside of the stomach of the animal. They take it out, the non-kosher animal. They put it in they mix it with the milk, and that makes the cheese. And that is forbidden. Now that we saw in our Mishnah. It's only going to be an Isra Basar B'chalav and forbidden if there's enough taste, but that's from a kosher animal. From a non-kosher animal, for sure that's forbidden. You can't use a non-kosher animal to make your cheese. You can't take the lining out of a non-kosher animal to make your cheese. That's a problem. But that's the problem, not ha-keva gufa sharia. But if it was actually in the non-kosher animal, it wouldn't be a problem. Now, what's really a little bit confusing here, and the Rif has a much better explanation, but we're going with Rashi, as to why, right, we're basically going to say this curdled milk is not really part of the animal. And it's not really milk from the animal. It's a separate entity, and it's not forbidden. It's not 100% clear why Rashi thinks this isn't forbidden, because in the end, right, isn't it likely it came from a non-kosher animal? I'm not sure why he doesn't think that. The Rif has a very interesting explanation, and Rashi doesn't go with it, and there's a whole different way of reading the sugya, but I want to just mention it. The Rif says it's just like a secretion of the animal. It's like almost like a waste of the animal, like something that happened in the animal's body, kind of like excrement or something, but it's not actually food, and it's not a real item that would be forbidden. So he doesn't view it as forbidden for that reason, because it's like he calls it pirsha ba'alma. Okay, but Rashi doesn't exactly say that, but he does say that this is just not part of the animal, and therefore it's not forbidden. Okay, so we have to just go with that. So now we have a problem, because Shmuel said, Kevat shchitat nochri is a nevela, and the Mishnah then reads, very simply, Kevat nochri vishal nevela. because it's a non-kosher animal, which is then going to be considered a nevela, is forbidden, the milk inside. But it's clear from what Shmuel says about why the cheese of non-Jews is forbidden is not for that reason, because that would be okay, like Rabbi Yeshua changed his mind. And he brings a different reason, okay? So, because it's used from the lining. To which the Gemara answers, Lo kashya, kan kodem chazara, kan lachar chazara. Don't worry. The Mishnah was written before Rabbi Yeshua changed his mind. And Shmuel is just explaining the Mishnah. It's not his opinion. He's explaining the Mishnah that was written before Rabbi Yeshua changed his mind. And then that was really the case. But Shmuel made his statement after. Okay, in other words, again, what was the theory of Rabbi Yeshua at first? He said whatever animal, right, the milk has the status of whatever animal it's in. But then they rejected that theory. So once they rejected that theory, then we go with something else, which is, when you take out the lining, that's the problem. Okay? So, in the end, we have a good explanation. But now we move on to the problem in the Mishnah itself, because the Mishnah itself says two different things. The Mishnah in the beginning, as we said, started out with saying whatever it takes on, whatever size the animal is. The end of the Mishnah said, it doesn't do that. It's wherever the milk came from. From non-kosher, it's not kosher. Came from kosher, it's kosher, even if it's in a non-kosher animal. So that's what the Gemara is going to say. Rashi on Kamen Atrefan basically quotes the end of the Mishnah. V'akatane reisha, doesn't it say in the reisha though? Kevat nochri v'shal nevela harezu asura. Right, the stomach of a nochri and a nevela is forbidden. So, Amar Rav Chisda, we're going to have two answers to this. Rav Chisda gives an interesting explanation. Reisha nir'eh ka'ochel nevelot, ha'cha'ika shchita. He distinguishes. He says, look, the reisha, it's talking about the animals and nevela. And if we allow you to eat the cheese in it, people will see you eating the cheese inside the nevela. They'll think, I can even eat a nevela, because if I can eat the cheese from the nevela that's inside, I can eat the nevela also. But hacha ika shchuta. But in our case, what's our case? The end of the Mishnah, where it was a treifa, right? It was a treifa animal, or a treif milk. But the animal was slaughtered. So if the animal was slaughtered, if the treifa animal was slaughtered, people will know then that's kshera, right? It ate milk from a kosher animal. We're going to permit that. Why? Because the animal was a treifa, but it was slaughtered properly. So people won't think, if you're eating the milk, I can eat the animal, because they'll say, right, there was a shechita done to it. It's not a nevela. It's not so bad, basically. We're going to say is nevela is terrible, so we're not going to allow you to eat something in a nevela. This animal was slaughtered, it just happened to be a treifa, so we'll let you eat the milk inside it, as long as the milk came from a kosher animal. I'm really Rabbi said, what kind of logic is that? You should say the opposite. Vilav kol dekenu, it's not a kol sheken, like all the more so. Meaning, like what? Uma nevela demisa. Now, nevela is so disgusting. Nobody wants to eat an animal that just died on its own. Diisharit lekevatano. If you permit what's eaten inside, lo ate lemechal mine. No one's going to say, I want to eat that nevela. Everyone knows the nevela is forbidden. And yet, amart lo, and yet you said, don't eat that milk either, that cheese, the curdled milk inside. But treifa shchuta, but a treifa that was slaughtered, deisharet ata lemechamine. Treifa that was slaughtered, look, it was slaughtered. People might actually think it's okay to eat. So lo kol sheken, that you should forbid the milk inside, because if you permit the milk inside, maybe people will think you can eat the treifa animal. So he doesn't like that reasoning. Anyway, in any case, we're going to bring a second answer. El amar Rav Yitzchak amar Rabbi Yochanan lo kashya. This is going to relate to what we said in the previous section. Kan kodem chazara, kan la'achar chazara. One is before, now the Mishnah has two parts and they contradict each other. But we already said that there were two parts that originally they thought one perspective, that the milk it takes on the status of the animal, and later they changed their mind. So the Mishnah at first quotes what the statement was said before Rabbi Yeshua changed his mind, and the latter part of the Mishnah was after Rabbi Yeshua had already changed his mind. Now, you might say, well then why do you leave the first part? Change it. But there's a principle, we've seen this many times, Mishnah lo zaza mimkoma. Once the Mishnah was written, we leave it. We don't start changing a Mishnah, even if it's wrong, or even if the person changed their opinion, we leave it. So we left that in, and then we added at the end what the opinion is now. Now we're going to have two statements, two psakim of Rabbi Yochanan, two opposite or differing opinions about what Rabbi Yochanan permitted or not in the following cases. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So the first is stated by Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Mamidim bekevat nevelot. Okay, as we saw before, you can actually create cheese in right, from milk that's inside a non-kosher animal, right? There was a nevela. Ve'ein ma'amidim b'kevat shchitat nochori. But not if it was slaughtered by a non-Jew. Now that doesn't make any sense. Didn't we say slaughtered by a non-Jew is a nevela? So hold off. Amar lefanav Rabbi Shimon bar Abba Kiman. According to who? So he goes to Rabbi Chia bar Abba. He says, according to who you're holding. And he thinks to himself. He said, maybe you're holding ki Rabbi Eliezer. Damar stam machshev nochri la'avodah zarah. Now we're going to add an additional issue. If we assume that most shchitas that non-Jews do are for idol worship purposes, then this becomes an animal that was used for idol worship. And at this point, it has milk inside of it. That's going to be all part of, it's better because it has this cheese inside of it, and that was benefit to the avodah zarah, to the idol. And therefore, if we assume any non-Jewish slaughter was done for idol worship, then it's an item of idol worship, and that's why he forbids it. So that's a separate reason. So he said, and that's only if you hold by Rabbi Eliezer. So he asked Rabbi Chia, is that why? Amar le, ve'ela kaman. Yeah, who else do you think I was holding by? Of course, that's what I meant. Now, Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, but Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak came from Israel, and he brought the Torah of Rabbi Yochanan. He said, "Mamidim bein bekevat nevela, bein bekevat shchitat nochri." He says, like our Mishnah, doesn't matter whether it's non-Jews, doesn't matter whether it was slaughtered or it was a regular nevela. Either which way, you're allowed to eat the milk. Shelo lachush l'divrei Rabbi Eliezer, because we're not worried that it was done for idol worship. We don't take seriously Rabbi Eliezer's position. We don't hold like it. The hilchata, and what's the halacha? Ein mamidim b'or kevat nevela, aval mamidim b'kevat nevela b'kevat shchitat nochri. So the halacha is, as we saw, we can't use the hide of a non-kosher animal for the rennet to go then take it and make cheese out of it. But mamidim b'kevat nevela b'kevat shchitat nochri. But you can do it if there was milk already curdled in a non-kosher animal. You're allowed to use it, even if it's owned by a non-Jew, like the second reading of Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, this last line is taken out by Rashi, and that's because if you look at the end, he says, what's the reason? Because chalav mekunas ba'pirsha ba'almahu. He says we don't care about the milk inside because it's not even food, and that really fits with the ritva. Okay, he says something, if you read this line, which I'm not going to read right now because it's pretty late, but if you read this line, you're going to see that he says something opposite of what we said, and that's because Rashi says that doesn't go with my opinion, and it must be wrong, and he takes it out of the text. And only the Rif takes it because he has a whole different reading, but we didn't go into the Rif's reading, so I'm not going to confuse you by starting to add that. But just so you should know that there is a different alternate reading of the text. Okay, with that we finish. We'll do a quick review. We started with Rav Mordechai and how he explained why we have the need for also Kilei HaKerem and all three. Then we went to we saw an opinion that it's actually permitted to benefit from Basar B'chalav, just not to eat. We saw Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yosef revealing what the difference between them is. And then we got into the whole making of the cheese and the different ways that it could be done, and how we end up saying in the end, we go by what the status of the milk is and not the status of what animal it's inside of. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.